Let me do sovereign power. You know, that started to sound a little crazy. But I like crazy. Sovereign power. Power derives from a social contract. This is sort of Hobbesian 101. We're not going to get into that. I'm going to assume everybody who's watching this understands what that means. It doesn't necessarily have to be Hobbesian either, though. But power derived from a social contract or line of succession or brute force, which entitlement is important, those who occupy such a position to rule. General explanation, Weber, Hobbes, no greater detail. Yeah, I'm not going to go into any of that. So the idea is when we're talking about sovereign power, we're talking about traditional sovereign power. I didn't even have to really write it on the board. We're talking about traditional a traditional articulation of sovereignty, right? There is a sense in which, and I mean traditional insofar as the state is obligated to protect its citizens, right? You know, one aspect of the conspiracy theory that really runs amok, I think, and really has a, and I'm not trying to tell people not to think conspiratorially. I'm not trying to say that, but one aspect of it that is really dangerous has to do with the attempt, because it almost can become, and I don't know how I feel about saying this publicly, but I'll say it, it almost runs the risk of being an act of terror, is to really incentivize fear in the population that the government really isn't working to protect you. The government really wants to harm you. And I'm not going to go into all the legislation and blah, 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 because none of that needs to be explicitly stated. If you have any understanding of anything having to do specifically with the U.S., you've seen videos and posts in your Facebook feed on particular things where there is an attempt to instill, I would argue, in the American specifically population, a very real fear that the government isn't about protecting you. That the government is specifically after you, Bob, Tom, Jane, Mary. The government's after you specifically. And if you dissent at all, then you could be locked up and detained indefinitely and blah, 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 blah. I've seen this going around quite a bit. Is there legitimacy to it? To an extent, but it's just, as an academic, it's the most egregious conceptual generalizations, right? They don't offer any indication of any evidence for this. Not to say that it doesn't happen. And the appropriation of the potential threat is 350 million American citizens. But the idea is there is no functional role for government if the government does not protect its population. Take it for someone who does this stuff for a living, right? I did genocide research at PhD level. Once the government starts killing its own people, it undermines, and we're talking about historically, this is proven, historically, it undermines its own power. So, irrespective of the fact of whether you believe this or not, and I'm not trying to convince you, the idea is just think from a purely egoistic standpoint. If it's the case that no one in government cared anything about the population, I don't believe this, but if it was all them and us, and they didn't care at all about us, you would have to at least acknowledge, out of sheer selfishness, they wouldn't want to undermine the belief in the protection of the population because that undermines their own power. So it's like, you got to sort of rein in the conspiracy theory folks a little bit because when you really draw the logical implications, it doesn't make sense. Unless it's the case, and it could be the case, that the government really is trying to destroy itself, right? Well, if it's trying to destroy itself, that's the great way to go. Because you will absolutely undermine your own power, and you will absolutely destroy yourself if you go that route. The problem is, however, if that state of affairs were to, and now I'm going back, I don't know why I'm going this deep today, but if that state of affairs were to, I gotta rein myself in, if that state of affairs were to manifest, there isn't any guarantee that measures to supplant existing power would effectively be implemented. Once everybody recognizes, holy crap, there's no power, it's a different population you're dealing with now, right? So, I'll give you an example. you facilitate a coup in order to overthrow the government, only to recognize that once you overthrow the government, the individuals or the militia group or the regime that you wanted to institute is immediately overpowered by someone who came out of nowhere. Right? So the idea is, why would you overthrow something that is functionally working in order to put into place something that may or may not work? No. In terms of power, we're still talking about power. In terms of power, if it's working, let it work. Let it do what it does. Why would you undermine that? So the idea that the idea that in terms of governance, you would undermine the belief in the population that you are protected for being an American, for being whatever your country is, for being a member of your population, that's the worst thing you can do. If you don't believe me, look what's happening in Syria right now. The idea is, if the population truly accepts the belief that they are not protected, then the state undermines its own power. And in order to preserve its own power, the only thing that it needs to do is to make you believe that you're being protected. That's it. As long as they do that. And that's easy. That's easy. So, for me, the conspiracy theory stuff gets a little too, it just doesn't follow at all, logically. And thus I move on. So, facilitative power. I gotta put a star by this myself, because I do conflict resolution theory proper, teach it at the PhD level, and I want to contribute something new to this discussion. I might touch on it briefly. Right now, I might. I gotta vibe it, see how I feel. I've been given a lot of goodies today. I feel like the lecture's a little off, though, so it's not my traditional sort of style. Usually I'm drawing more pictures, and, it's a little more happy-go-lucky. Now it's just like point. Facilitative power. Power which is created or the product of existing systems. This is exactly what I'm saying. Why would you want to change it if it's already functional? We already got power. Think of it like this. And I'm going to finish this, but I just want to sort of slow it down a little bit. Me personally, gotten to a position in my life where, and not that I'm big on this, because the truth is I'm really not. I like more the idea that, and this is true, I love the idea that I have an ability to create stuff that more powerful people might want to use. So that's what motivates me in life, is the ability to fashion instruments, theoretical instruments that could potentially be useful to someone more powerful than me. It's the role of a blacksmith. It's the role of an artisan. That's my vibe. But the idea is, I've gotten, me personally now, independent of that, I've personally gotten to this level because of any number of factors, which include diligence, work, and such. Having gotten to this position, why would I undermine this position? This is the position that's brought me power. So why would I undermine education? I wouldn't do that. There's no way. This is why I'm the biggest proponent of education. At least one take is because it's obviously he's the biggest proponent of education because it's ego-driven. This isn't necessarily the case. I'm not saying that. But the truth is, there is some legitimacy to that claim. Of course Dr. Campbell is the one who's giving away free iPads every couple months for education. You do a 4-minute video, you get a freaking iPad. Of course Dr. Campbell is the one throwing up videos all day about education, because education is what feeds his ego, what gives him power, what gives him meaning, what gives him means to more power. So of course he's going to defend education. Who else would defend education? This guy's invested in education, virtually and residentially, right? But that's the exact same point, right? If you can recognize that about me, then you should be able to recognize that about the state. Of course the state's not going to make you really believe that the state's going to come by in a black van, a bunch of dudes are going to come out with earpieces and pull your daughter out of the kitchen while she's making brownies for mom and take her off to some detention center and some FEMA camp. I mean, now if that does happen, then the question is, what did your daughter have? I shouldn't make light of this, right? But the idea is, and I admit my bias, so you can critique me on this point. It's cool. But my honest belief is, if that does happen, what was your daughter doing? I guess the conspiracy theorist doesn't really recognize the facilitative aspect of power. Is that facilitatively, power, in terms of the system, manifests as a product of of protecting and organizing existing power.